people already. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining in.
Hello.
Excited to start working with everybody and going through it. So welcome to the Racers 360 webinar. Just to give you guys a quick introduction to Zoom as you file in here. If you kind of go on the screen with your mouse by our beautiful, beautiful faces today and scroll down to the bottom, you should see a chat window. If you hit the chat window throughout the webinar, you're going to be able to ask us questions, join in on the conversation. We'd love to have you, message us any questions if you got it in. There you go, Joe. Of course, we're excited. Thank you for joining in. So a quick introduction. I am Dion von Moltke. I have been an IMSA driver. Luckily, I've won the Rolex at Daytona 24-hour, Sebring 12-hour a few times. Coached a few of you, I'm sure, as well. Nelson, you want to talk a little bit about yourself and your history?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Nelson Mason. So I come from the open wheel background. So I did World Series and Formula 2 and now back on the North American side of the pond, which is good.
Absolutely. So Nelson's been one of our most active coaches and does a really, really great job. So the structure of today, what we want to talk about is we've now at Racers 360 worked with hundreds of drivers, and we want to talk about kind of the main core mistakes that each of us sees. And we both see different things. We communicate in different ways, and we kind of have different opinions on how that works. So I'm going to start off and talk about what I've seen. We're going to use pretty much the same techniques that we use in our one-on-one coaching. We're going to use onboard video, really be able to pause it, draw on the screen, highlight everything, be kind of very crisp with it. Nelson's going to go through and do the same thing with what he sees and what he wants to cover. And then at the end, we have a quick announcement that we'll run through, introduce to everyone a new service that we're launching at Racers 360. And then we're going to open up to a Q&A session where you guys can ask about anything you want. We'll have an extended one. We'll try to run through that and answer as many questions as you have. So thank you again for joining us. We're really excited to have you here. Like I said, if you have questions during or want to communicate with us during the fact, leave us a question in the chat button down over here. Just type us a message just like that. And with that, let's just jump right into it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So we're here at Heartland Park. We've got an onboard camera here. What I want to do here is I'm going to play this just full speed to start off with. And what I want everyone to focus in on initially is the driver's, whoopsie daisies, that's an error one, the driver's throttle position down here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it where the driver picks up their initial throttle application. So let's go here. We're going to play it full speed. Driver's coming in, brake zone, pretty good brake zone, turning in. So we've started to feed the throttle in back in here. Now, the next thing I'm going to look at is where does the driver get back to full throttle. So we're starting to add throttle, pause at about 50% throttle, and see how we're only getting back to that full throttle application as we get out to the exit curve. That is just way too late. So the number one mistake that I see amateur drivers making, it revolves around where they pick up the initial throttle application. And this is really wrong for a few ways, and there's a few reasons why it's not talked about as much. So you can see here, our driver is starting to feed that throttle in just a little bit here. And you can see from their input on the steering wheel from their hands, they have a lot of steering input in the car. They're asking, their body, their mind's asking for the car to turn. They're trying to get that car to rotate down to the apex. At the very same moment, their feet are starting to apply the throttle. And when we apply the throttle, we're taking weight off the front end. We're shifting it to the rear end. And where the weight goes is where the grip goes. So while their hands, their body are asking the car for that front grip to carve down to the apex, their feet are taking away front grip. So their feet and their hands aren't communicating. So one of the most critical things for drivers to do is to time the moment for where they pick up their initial throttle application to come as they're starting to unwind the steering wheel. Most drivers are going to complain, and most drivers talk to us, hey, I've got understeer, I can't get the car to rotate. 90% of the time, it's because they picked the throttle too early. So here at this driver, we want to see them wait, 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 right here. As they're ready to start unwinding the steering wheel, that's where our initial throttle needs to come in. And if we do that correctly, we're going to have more weight on the front end. We're going to have a little bit more rotation. That's what we want. When an oversteer is a negative, we call it oversteer. When we need that oversteer, we call it rotation. So the car is going to then be pointed more down the road. They're going to be looking more down the road. So they're going to be able to start unwinding the steering wheel. And then they're going to be able to start to get back to full throttle earlier. So I want to see this driver back to full throttle here. The next thing is if we were to talk about what their throttle trace would look like on data, if you notice here, they've got a long pause at 50% throttle. So they get up to the initial throttle, they hold it, hold it, hold it, and then they finally get back to full throttle after a while. It's supposed to be flatline. What we want to see a throttle trace look like is more like this. Not an on-off switch, but delayed and then much quicker. No pause in the middle here. So what we're really looking for is trying to actually get back to full throttle as early as possible. Let's see, we've got a question here from Ash. What about an uphill corner at Lime Rock Park? So Lime Rock Park, slightly different just because it's not going to be one of those hairpin corners. It's a very light brake zone. You want to roll that speed up the hill. I would say Lime Rock Park is the exception. Sorry, the uphill at Lime Rock Park is the exception to the rule. Sometimes in those higher speed corners where you want to get a little bit more weight on the wheel, you'll want a slightly earlier throttle application. Not from the second you turn in back to throttle. It might be 2 car lengths earlier, but not much more than that. In low horsepower front wheel drive rear wheel cars, I am full throttle at the apex and winding as I track out fully before I crest the hill. That sounds pretty good to me. In a low horsepower car, the throttle becomes more of an on-off switch. But in the typical corner, so talking about Lime Rock, West Bend, turn 4, turn 3, as much as you can in Big Bend, you really want to try and delay that initial throttle application. We're going to get into that why right now. So our driver here is picking up the throttle too early. Well, it's typically because drivers have been taught, and this is I'm sure most of you have been told this in your careers and enjoyment at the track, that you always have to be on the throttle or the brakes. While that is, to be clear, it's mostly untrue. I know I coast a lot when I'm driving a race car. Nelson, how about you? Do you coast a good bit on the racetrack?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, you're trying to find the limit of the car. So the limit of the car isn't always on or off throttle, or I mean, on throttle or on the brake. It's, you know, usually in a steady state situation.
Yeah. So when we're talking about a corner like this, more for a traditional, you know, kind of not quite a hairpin, but, you know, you're braking in, you've got your throttle spot, you're using it. The ideal situation here in this corner is, yes, you want to trail brake down to the apex point. You want to be kind of really limit your coast time. But most drivers aren't ready to do that. So for us, that technique or that phrase sets up your priority list as a driver in the wrong way. What is more important for a driver is where they're picking up the initial throttle. That's more important than trying to be always on the brakes, always on the throttle. So if you're not experienced with trail braking and rolling in entry speed, you're going to brake into the corner, you're going to turn in, and you're going to be like, well, I'm too slow, so that means I need to slowly get off the throttle, off the brakes and get to throttle. But what's more important there is just to get off the brakes, let it roll, 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 and then get to throttle. And then we can work on the actual issue here. The actual issue is overslowing entries. So step one that we want to see, the fundamental thing we want to see, is start to apply the throttle in the correct position. Once we build that in, then we can build in the trail brake. And then we can start to work on coming off the brakes and rolling that speed in correctly. So we have another question here. We talk about maintenance throttle versus deceleration. I think just for your question, I think Nelson, correct me if I'm wrong here, Nelson, I think we're going to really hit that pretty hard on the head in your section. Am I correct there?
Yeah, quite a bit, I would say.
So let me just delay answering your question. I think we're going to have a better input on it for the next section when Nelson takes over here. So once we've kind of built that discipline and say, I'm not allowed to get the throttle until I start to unwind the steering wheel, and you feeling like if you're over slowing the entry, and this is going to be step 2 of the problem, we don't work on rolling more entry speed by braking deeper. Because what ends up happening for most drivers, if you go straight to braking deeper, what happens? Your anxiety rises because now you're like, oh gosh, I got to brake deeper, I got to brake deeper. And your eyes focus on the brake. So what happens is when anxiety comes up, eyes go down. So now what happens is if you try initially braking deeper, you're so focused on where you're trying to brake, your eyes are so focused there that you actually hold the brakes for too long and you overslow the corner. So it's a counterproductive measure. So what we want to see here is brake at the exact same point, but then work on getting off of that relative heavy pressure in each brake zone earlier. So I'd want to see that driver right now start to release that brake, release that brake, release that brake. And now we're going to start to really tie in our hands and feet. So as you turn into the corner, your foot needs to be coming off. And it should feel like your big toe is just resting on the brake pedal, resting, a little bit of coast, throttle, and now you're going to have that rotation to get back to full throttle earlier. And what we're going to do now, so we've talked about all of that and really put the highlight. I'm going to show you some data on why this is the case. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and then go and share a data clip here. So we're looking, can you guys all see the data? Does that look good to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're here at New Jersey Motorsports Park. And what I want to highlight here is, let me get these tools up 1 second. So I'm looking in this section right now. So our throttle trace is here. This is speed trace. And the middle one is the time delta. So what we can see here, by looking at this section here, we can see, hey, neither of these throttle traces are great. The red's picking up the initial throttle earlier than the green lap. We can see the green lap has another cardinal sin where they get up to throttle and have to release some. That costs actually a good amount of time. We always want to have a nice throttle trace that should have no release and back up to full throttle. But what I really want to highlight here and drive home is see how, and I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, slow in, fast out, right? But we can see here, so the red lap is slower in, they're back to throttle before the green lap, but they're only getting back to full throttle later. So you can see they picked it up, they've induced that understeer, and that understeer they've induced is not allowing them to get back to full throttle until it's too late. So what the green lap has done is actually rolled in more entry speed. You can see the green lap, if I can move my face out of the way here, has rolled in 2.5 miles an hour more. They've gotten to throttle later, but they get back to full throttle much earlier. And you can see for a second here, the red lap is a little bit faster. They gain a little bit of time in the middle of the corner, but because the green lap commits back to that full throttle much earlier, that green lap is going to gain nearly 2.5 tenths on exit. So that's the key thing here is it's not slow in, fast out, and try to get the throttle as early as possible. Being on throttle as early as possible does not maximize your exits. What matters is trying to get back to full throttle and where you get back to initial throttle and trying to combine those with entry speed. So what we want to see is initially some coasting's okay. Let the car roll to the apex, wait. As you start to unwind the steering wheel, get back to that full throttle, and now you're going to have more entry speed, and you're actually going to have better exits as well. So for me, in my opinion as a coach, this is the most fundamental thing that amateur drivers should be focusing on, and it is what's going to unlock the most amount of speed here. So now I've got this back. Hopefully that all makes sense to everybody. As we said, you can always ask questions here, but we're going to have a proper Q&A session at the end. So Nelson, do you want to kind of take over, talk a little bit about what you want to focus on?
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to, both Dion and I do agree that, the throttle application is the most, let's say, fundamental thing that isn't done perfectly by everybody. I mean, amateurs and professionals alike. You know, it's still something that even when I'm learning a track, it's something that I struggle with. And as I weed that out, the car gets better, the lap times get better, everything starts to work and makes your life a lot easier. So it's something that doesn't require, you know, more bravery or more commitment. It's just doing the fundamental things in order and properly allowing the car to work. The other area that I think we can focus on is really line and why we're doing lines the way that we're doing, and you know, and how to think about each corner and how we approach each corner. It's a little odd and it's a little difficult, but you know, we see these corners and we see hairpins and we think, okay, there's one way to do it, and maybe we've seen somebody else do it, so we do it that way, and we're not completely sure as to why we're doing things the way that we're doing, or why the line is that way, or if that's even the right line or not. We don't know. We just saw, you know, some guy do it, and we're following suit. So I'm going to try to speak to the way that we can let's say strategize our lines and make the track work for us rather than us against the track, so to speak. So I'm going to cut in. Can everybody see this? Are we?
Yeah, I got that. And
Okay.
by the way, everybody, I know that this when we share our screens, it's kind of annoying. It makes everything go full screen. If you hit escape, it should show the chat again, but you can also access the chat during full screen. If you scroll to the top of your screen, you should see a chat up there as well, just in case it closes your chat as it goes to full screen.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to run through pit race here. A difficult section. This is going to be the S section that we run through, where it seems to go on forever, and you can kind of get lost in it a little bit. So we're going to break it down as to make it quite a bit easier to think about, and why there is a way to do it, and there's, you know, maybe a better way than we're doing it right now. And this kind of lends to the maintenance throttle versus coasting aspect that we were talking about. So first, I'll kind of run it through because it's a long section. So I'll kind of run the back-to-back, and then we'll back it up and explain just the adjustments that we can make to make our lives a little bit easier, and just find time without really having to, like I say, be more courageous within the car. So we come into the braking zone here, and what we've done is we've really held it to the right side quite a bit, and that opens our entry for the left. But then we're kind of in between, so we're in between on the left. Now we're sort of in between on the right. Now we're sort of in between again on the left, and we use a lot of space on the exit of this left, and then we're really compromised for the right-hander. So it's like, okay, yeah, maybe if we minimize the compromise on each corner, we'll kind of get through the section as best as possible. If we think about it a little bit differently as to, let's say, a level of importance for each corner, we'll see things in a different light. So right now we're coming down a fairly decent straight, and we have a right-hand corner at the end of this straight that then leads into a very short chute and a left-hander. So when we look at the level of importance of where our speed should be, you know, compromising this right-hander or slowing the car down quite a bit more in order to keep the car to the right side, that's not going to give us the benefit that we just had of the straight and carrying that speed in. So one thing to keep in mind is we have 3 right-handers in this section and 2 left-handers. So if we think about it, maybe if we can maximize every right-hander, we will be gaining, you know, 60% of the time. And then if we compromise the left-handers, we'll only be compromising 40% of the time instead of compromising through the whole section.
And I think there's an important note here that's a distinction for how pro drivers think about the racetrack. Is there's a conscious thought of how much distance can I maximize being faster for? So if I am slightly slower for a little bit of time or one corner to maximize a corner that is a higher speed or a longer distance corner, we're going to benefit from it. And I think a lot of amateur drivers just there's not that thought process of, well, why do I want to maximize, or can I gain time by being faster for a longer period of time?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's that, if we think about it, if we carry the speed through this right-hander, we are going to be compromised on the left-hander. So we're going to be taking this line and then be, a little bit tight in this left-hander. But we're having to compromise the left-hander no matter what the situation is. So we might as well gain as much as we can in this area here. So as we roll this forward, right now now the lines don't make sense, but we've kind of done the red line where we're realistically holding it to the right side of the track. As we roll this forward, we can see that if we really carried the speed, our line would be kind of coming in this way, and we'd be pretty snug in here. But, it's a braking zone to begin with. We're going to have to slow down for that left anyway. But the reality is we might be traveling at, 80 miles per hour here instead of 67 miles per hour. So right now we've already slowed down. We're not going to really get an acceleration zone in here. So if we watch our speed, we'll notice that we don't drastically change from the 67. We go up 8 miles per hour, and then we're back slowing down. So instead of carrying that sort of 80 miles per hour across the corner, through the short chute, and then into this tight left where we're down to 67 miles per hour anyway, we've just lost that advantage. Now, what we do here is kind of the same thing, is that we have the right-hander coming up. So if we try to maximize the right-hander, we've already compromised this left. So we might as well compromise it enough to have our car in the right position. So what you want to do is, it's like that saying when you're racing in the rain, whether it's rain or dry or mixed conditions, it's better to just be on the right tire at the right time, and everything else doesn't matter. So you don't have to take those guesses on switching to slicks or whatever it'll be. You're better off having the car in the right position the majority of the time. So it's really a law of percentages. But to speed this up,
So Nelson, jump in there really quick to expand upon one thing that I think is really important, how I like to communicate it, is when you have corners like this, and I was just coaching someone earlier today through the S's at Coda. So almost any of these S's that, even if they decrease speed or increase speed, if you can't really make up time in the middle of them, and I should say that more, if you arrive into the S's with 8 miles an hour more to make up a number, once you get into the S's, that 8 miles an hour, you kind of just carry it through all of them. You can't, if I am slower into a hairpin that leads onto the back straightaway, but I can get back on the throttle, I can eventually make up for the time lost down the back straightaway, maybe brake slightly deeper. But in these momentum corners where you can't really brake any deeper, you're trying to keep the car weight planted so you can roll in the speed. If you're able to arrive into the first left here, the previous corner, 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 miles an hour faster, you might have a little bit more of a break into them, but if you sacrifice the setup and try to roll, you're going to end up with nearly the same apex speed. You're going to end up with pretty much the same car angle, and now I'm still going to be 3-4 miles an hour faster at that point. So it's kind of one of those things, if you can't make up the time, you got to roll it in initially, and that'll carry you through all of the S's. Hopefully that makes some sense.
Absolutely. And this is where it actually becomes a little bit more important, because right now, because we sacrificed the first right-hander in this video. We sacrificed the first right-hander, and then we kind of sacrificed the left-hander, but not enough to really have our car in a perfect position. If we thought about this as this was a straight going into this right-hander, then this is not the trajectory or the position that the car would be in. So we sacrificed the first corner of the S's, the second corner of the S's. Now we're stuck in a position where we're going to have to sacrifice this one because we've really put ourselves into a weight transfer point of view, where had we just focused our sacrifice on the left-hander, then our sacrifice would be done for these three corners. We would have carried the speed into the right-hander, gained the time there, not really lost a handful of time in the left-hander, and then gain time again. So we would gain time, lose a little, gain time, lose a little, gain time. So if we, count the amount of times we're gaining time, it's going to be beneficial. So just having the car in the right position here will allow this right-hander to be a little better for us, carrying a little bit more speed across the corner, using up a little bit more of this road. And again, just like the first one, if we really attack it, then we're using a little bit more road and we're a little bit tighter on the left. But what we can do when we're a little bit tighter on the left is then really focus on, okay, over this hill, we're going to make sure that we're good for the right-hander coming up. So if we sacrifice a little bit more, keep it a little bit tighter, then this right-hander opens up for us completely. Now, the reality is from this point where we, let's say, are back to full throttle somewhere around here, if we do this properly, we're on full throttle from this point all the way down to the braking zone down here. Whereas instead what we're doing is we're still kind of in between, and just watch our throttle through here. So we're kind of in between through this left. We're still getting out of the throttle as we're coming down the hill, sliding a little bit wide. Out of the throttle, still out of the throttle, still out of the throttle, still out of the throttle. And we're actually getting back to full throttle here. So we have now lost the entire advantage of our straight by just not sacrificing properly. And it's just making a plan where, what do we have to gain? If with this S, it's, as Dion said, it's very difficult in the middle of the section and everything kind of evens out. But if we can come in better and come out better, then we have two massive gains. Mm-hmm. And this gain carries all the way down the straight. So that's what I mean by being strategic. Is right now, with the way the video is, we've kind of just put ourselves in between, and we're not fully committed. We're kind of sacrificing, and we're sacrificing 100% of the S's section. So the entire section is just a mediocre approach.
So, sorry to jump in here, but I think this is the perfect time to kind of go back to Samed's question earlier about coasting versus maintenance throttle. I look at maintenance throttle as a negative. I try to avoid it at almost all times. And if you listen to a subtle kind of how we were talking about it, where Nelson was saying if you attack in and attack out, I would rather see you try to attack in entry, coast, let the car rotate, roll that speed, and then get back to that throttle and go, where you can kind of see here where our driver is a little bit lazy, doesn't really know what they're trying to hit on, and that actually kind of leads into this dull maintenance throttle section. So for the most part, I would consider maintenance throttle as a negative. And an interesting thing that I honestly didn't expect is if you look at amateur driver's data and you look at a pro driver's data, what's really interesting to me is the amateur driver is actually going to spend a higher percent of the lap on throttle, but the pro driver is going to spend a much longer period of time at full throttle. So try to always think about get back to that full throttle. So it applies out of hairpins, and it kind of applies in and out of this section as well. Question here from David here. Broadly speaking, it is usually optimize the entry of a corner of a complex and sacrificing one or more of the following since you are slow in a slow part of the track. I don't know if you can broaden this out to say, usually saying it's going to be attack the entry of a complex corner, because if this section was only 3 corners and that third corner led onto a long straightaway, well, then we're going to focus a little bit more on the exit. But Nelson, how would you answer that question out of interest?
Yeah, that's just it. It's impossible to say that, there's no blanket corner, right? So it's impossible to say that, oh, in a hairpin, you late apex the hairpin, because we don't know if it's a long straight leading into the hairpin, or if it's a long straight leading out of the hairpin and a short straight leading into the hairpin. So what you want to do is maximize where your time gain is going to be. So in any time there's a slow corner, you have to look at what's leading in and what's leading out. So that's where the strategy comes into play. If you have a hairpin is the easiest example, so we'll use that. Let's say you have a short run into a hairpin and then a really, really long straight coming out. Well, in that case, what we're going to do is really set up for the exit of the hairpin and make sure that we're the best down the straight as possible. Because the little bit of time that we're going to lose entering, we're going to gain in handfuls going down the straight. Now, if you have a really long straight entering into the hairpin and a short shoot coming out, then we don't have to set up for the exit. We want to focus on making sure we're as quick in as possible and sacrifice that exit a little bit. So it's all about how does the track play to you and how does the track play to your car? So if that kind of answers what we're...
Yeah, and just to build on, we'll have a bigger Q&A here in a bit, just to answer Scott's question about turn 3 through 5 at Road America. Scott, I would say turn 3 at Road at Road Atlanta. Totally misread that. Turn 3 through 5 at Road Atlanta is one of those corners that you're going to maximize your entry and maximize the exit out of 5. So I want to maximize bringing the car down into that first S, and that carries you through the kind of left into the right of turn 5, but then the exit's pretty critical there as well. So it's kind of maximize entry that carries through it because you're kind of flat from the first apex in most cars, and then you maximize the exit. So there's not going to be ever a blanket statement that'll says, hey, in this situation, you have to maximize this or the other thing. What you should try to do is say, what is going to average out to make me faster over the longest distance? So in turn 3 through 5 at Road Atlanta, I know, hey, if I can carry that speed in, I'm going to be able to keep it through, but then I have to be able to maximize it out of 5 as well. So entry speed into turn 5 matters a little bit less than the exit speed out of turn 5, where the opposite is true into the S's. So it's always about, if you can figure that kind of key out, what's going to make me faster for a longer period of time, you can take that and apply it to any track in any car.
Yeah, so so this is still an absolutely awful drawing. So it's not going to be anybody's fridge anytime soon. But really, what this will kind of show on the S is the green line is sort of, let's say, what I'm proposing, and the red line is kind of what we've done right now. So as we have a really long straight that leads in, the red line, which is the current video line, is really slowing up the car as much as possible in order to keep it right here to prepare for a corner that we are then deciding not to maximize. So we are then kind of in between, and then we're sort of in between. So this pace from this point here all the way through to really this point here, we're in between and we're sacrificed, and we're not maximizing any point of the section because we're saying, well, it's a tricky left-right section and we're just trying to keep the car, hitting the apexes, and that's really our focus.
So would you say the green lap and the red lap would be pretty much the same speed through that middle section?
Most likely, yes, absolutely. Because what you're going to have are sort of peaks and valleys. So really, I'll do this. I'll say from, this point on to this point, the green and the red lap, just in this center here, will be traveling over the same period of time. But the gain is the green lap gains a boatload of time up to this point, and gains a boatload of time coming out all the way over to the braking zone over here. And that's where your time gain is. Your time gain is really here and here. And what that does is that builds the time for the whole lap. So really we don't lose anything from this point to this point. It's just setting it up differently. So we're setting up for where we can gain time rather than doing the specific corners one by one in front of us, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And to talk sort of more about the strategy that we can approach for the lap, or, you know, how to, let's say, maximize the in and out of the, you know, how to maximize each corner specifically. Here's what I call sort of the last corner on the track, really the one of the most important. As we come in here, it's a hairpin, and we've sort of laid apex the hairpin, but we have a bunch of track on the outside. So we haven't really maximized our exit with the way that the track is. So we've come in, we've braked really late, that's all well and good, but we haven't really maximized the exit. And this exit is now, the loss of speed on this exit is going to hurt us all the way down this whole section, all the way down to basically the first sector of the lap. So if we approach it a little bit differently by carrying our speed, looking ahead and seeing where our exit point can be, we'll have actually a better exit. And every half a mile per hour, 1 mile per hour better we have on the exit, that is all going to carry the speed all the way along here. So instead of just looking at it as a natural arc line and we'll get a good exit by just kind of late apexing it, we're not, let's say, playing to what the track is giving us. So just being a little bit more strategic with how we choose our lines is kind of the best way forward.
That's funny. This is our first time that I've heard you walk through this, and what you're pointing out there is probably one of the most common things I also talk about. Is we always say, okay, on a corner like this, we can clearly see, hey, that driver should have been using more road on exit. Like saving an extra meter of not running out there doesn't equate to opening those hands and letting the car be free and getting out to the exit curb, right? And maybe it's less so here, but another critical thing to think about in nearly every corner, especially those hairpin corners that I was showing before, is not just getting out and using all the track, but when you get out there. And one thing I've seen is, you know, if you're exiting onto a straightaway, quite often drivers will eventually get out to the exit curb and they'll eventually get parallel with it, but it's only at the end of the exit curb, where we want to see drivers getting out and parallel with that exit curb by the start of it and letting the car be free much earlier. Quite often, that's your eyes, and getting those eyes before you get to the apex. Almost it's like after I'm turning in, I'm no longer looking for that apex. I'm looking for that exit curb. And I'm trying to ask myself, how early can I start to unwind the steering wheel so I can maximize my throttle and let the car be free? And that's the strategy of what we're trying to maximize on the exit there and having a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly it. It's just having a plan, having a strategy as to why you're doing a corner the way that you're doing it. You know, it's, I always say, like, you know, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. I find with driving, that's a lot how it is. You know, people will see a track specialist do it a certain way, and then they just do it that way, but they're not really putting together as to why they're doing it that way. And we don't know that way is the proper way, but it's, you know, it's just trying to learn as to what the strategy is behind why we pick the lines that we do, and building out from that will be, you know, massively beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That was really what I had to say.
Awesome. That is fantastic. So what we want to do really quick here before we open it up to a Q&A session to everyone, we have one really exciting announcement that we're really pumped about at Racers 360 here. So what I'm going to show you all is we will be launching a premium content subscription. And with that, we're going to be offering a 20% off early bird specials. This comes out in August. So what you can expect is we're going to have our in-depth track breakdowns where we go corner by corner, just like what you saw here. Talk about what we need to execute on, what we want. We're going to have written notes as well for every corner on the track that you can download. We already have those track breakdowns for more than 35 tracks around the U.S. By the time we launch in mid-August, it should be over 40 tracks, and we'll be working on getting one for every track in the U.S. as soon as possible. We're also going to have entries to all of our webinars, so that'll be completely free. So if you're part of our subscription, our coaches are going to be hosting their own webinars consistently. So you'll have free access to any webinar, to all the recordings for all the webinars that we have. And then we're also going to have, as part of our dashboard, a chat messaging system with our coaches. So if you're working one-on-one with them, you'll be able to follow up a coaching session, chat with them. Even if you're not, if you have a quick question, have a chat with them. They're going to be accessible, and it'll be a really, really cool system. All of that is going to we're going to cost $100 a year. And like I said, 20% off today. So it's only $80. You get all those track breakdowns. You get the webinars, exclusive access to it, content that our coaches can be making, chat systems. We're really excited about that. We hope that you'll join us there as well and get more stuff like this from Nelson, from Mike Skeen, Cameron Lawrence, and all of us there. I will enter that link into the chat system. At the end of this webinar, you're also going to get a recording of it. We'll include a link to that as well, just in case you are interested. So with that, I want to do a really quick poll so that we can understand who's here, how to tailor some of these questions. So if you guys don't mind, just really quick, we got 2-question poll. Just understand us here. If you can answer that, we can know how to tailor some of these questions to you. And then once we get some results in there, we will open up the Q&A session. So let me just give it a minute here. Looks like we got a pretty good mix of drivers here. Wheel to wheel, about 50% of you. HPDE, about 50% of you. Awesome. So that's good enough for here. Awesome. Thank you, guys. See some of the results here. Perfect. So let's open up the Q&A. To ask questions, if you can, if you scroll over to where our faces are, can you go down to the bottom? You should see a Q&A section. If you click on the Q&A and type your questions in there, that'll help us manage it versus writing it in the chat, which will be a little bit harder for us to manage. Let's see here. Sean, we'll just start with yours. The first one to ask a question. I understand what you're saying about throttle application on a normal corner and do that pretty well. I have a Miata Memento car and having issues with long, wide sweeping right-hander carousel. Let's see at Memphis. This carousel has a decreasing radius, so it has a very late apex and can take me onto a flat-out section. I've tried several different approaches and none of them seem to be better than others. I just feel like I'm waiting forever to get back to full throttle. I'm in the corner for so long. If I give it more throttle, it starts to push. I miss the apex. It seems that everyone I talk to takes it differently, so I can't figure out the best way to attack that for a Miata. So Sean, what I would say, and I've not been to Memphis, but it sounds like to me in most carousels, those are corners where kind of similar to what we were talking about with Nelson on thinking about how you want to maximize to be fastest for the longest distance. So if I think about the Road America carousel, which I think it sounds like it can relate to, I want to carry that aggressive throttle in as much as possible, turn in, drive it in until the car starts to understeer a little bit away. Then I coast, lift off, let the car coast. That shifts a little bit of weight to the front end, so I get a little bit of that rotation. And then I come back and almost like I double apex it. So then I can maximize the entry, throw away the middle, and then I can maximize the exit. That little bit of that rotation is what allows me to get back to full throttle earlier. Nelson, what do you think that makes sense? Would you
Actually, I completely agree. I mean, if anybody's seen my coaching videos, I love the sort of double apex approach on longer corners, because that's just it, is that you can maximize the entry, you can maximize the exit, and the midpoint of the corner where you're rotating the car, it doesn't really matter because it's such a short period versus the rest of the time that you're in the corner. So yeah, I completely agree. Drive it in, let the car rotate, and then once the car started to rotate and you start to, it's just that point. You're still, just as to Dion's point earlier in the webinar, when you have that point where you believe you're apexing, it doesn't have to be on a curb. The apex doesn't have to be that specific point. It's where you feel that now you're starting to open up your hands and you can get back into the throttle and open up your hands on the exit of the corner. So really, my whole goal on every corner is to use the minimum amount of, let's say, throttle presses and brake presses. So I want to brake once and I want to throttle once. If that's not possible, then you throttle twice. But I want to avoid doing it 3, 4, 5 times. It's just minimizing the weight transfer. That will always keep the car planted as best as possible.
Yeah, absolutely here. Okay, so from Matthew here, do fast drivers anticipate oversteer so they can get onto full throttle earlier when exiting a corner? What do you think, Nelson?
Well, yes, I would say that you do anticipate the oversteer. I think, it sounds to me like what you're wondering is, if you're sort of adjusting the handling of the car based on when you're getting back to throttle and things like that. And I mean, for sure, whenever, you're in a corner, every car is different and you have to manage the handling of that a little bit differently. But I wouldn't say that, if you're having to anticipate the oversteer, then I wouldn't say you're necessarily getting in the throttle earlier. I would say you're probably getting in the throttle later because you're waiting to that point where you're no longer, let's say, anxious of where the oversteer is going to hit. What you want to do is remove that, let's say, anxiety altogether. And that's where getting on the throttle a little bit later, when you're able to start opening your hands, that's when you remove that question completely out of it. I never go into a corner expecting it to oversteer unless I'm, in a race situation, the setup is what it is and I'm stuck with what I've got. But if it's a practice session, qualifying session, whatever, you work on making sure that that's not the case and maximizing, keeping the car with as little slip angle always at all times, if that answers that.
To be honest with you, if I am in that race situation and I'm anticipating some oversteer, what I'm going to manipulate is my brake zone, not my throttle. So then I might back up my initial brake zone a little bit so that as I turn in, I can have less brake pressure on it, right? If we're talking about entry oversteer, entry speed, yeah. So if I've got that entry oversteer, well, then I want less brake pressure after the turn in because then I'll have less weight on the front nose. You'll theoretically have less front grip, less pitch. So then I can mask some of that oversteer. So you've got more manipulations on the braking part of the corner and how you work the weight transfer then than when I get back to full throttle. So from Kevin here, how do I work on carrying more entry speed into traditional hairpin 90 degree corners in a short wheelbase / twitchy car? So Kevin, I like to coach this in a 3-part way, and it really doesn't matter what type of car you're in. I think step 1 will help you get maybe more used to this and maybe even a little bit of setup work. But like I was just talking about, so if the car's super twitchy on entry, I might have a coast period. I might not be able to trail brake as deep as I want to. So if you can't do anything on the setup and you have to mask your driving style, I'm not masking where I pick up initial throttle. For me, that is a priority. So if I'm going to use turn 10 at Sebring, for instance, I don't know why I picked that, but I did. I'm only going to pick up the throttle as I start to unwind the steering wheel, as I get to that apex point. But during the heat of the day there in the 12-hour, it often becomes really sketchy on entry. So I'm going to back up my initial brake so that as I start to unwind the steering wheel, I'm going to have less pressure than I typically do, less brake pressure. I'm going to coast, let the car roll, so I've got slightly more weight on the rear end, and that allows that twitchiness to go away to a point, and allows me to continue to work on rolling that entry speed in. So the first step for me there is to just get off the brakes and let the thing coast. That's step 1. Step 2 is as you start to coast and rolling speed in, we want to build in that trail brake. So then we're going to build in just small amounts of brake pressure by getting off of the relatively heavy brake pressure. So if I'm going to, let me just use a whiteboard really quick here. I'm going to use data or a data graph to help me explain the way I like to coach it. So as we work on trail braking and rolling at entry speed, the last thing we work on is braking deeper. So let's say the typical brake zone for you, I'm going to make something up, looks like this. You get up to heavy brake pressure pretty well. You hold that heavy brake pressure. Because the car is pretty twitchy, you release the brakes like this. So for me, the next step of rolling entry speed, it's not braking deeper, braking at the same point with the exact same initial brake pressure, but it's getting off the relative heavy brake pressure much earlier in the brake zone and extending our brake zone to be longer. And the difference of the slopes of the lines here is where the entry speed will come from. And that's going to be the hardest part of driving a race car for me, and what separates the great drivers from the good drivers is typically entry speed. And this is a really hard concept. So the big thing I want you to think about is hard initial brake pedal and then coming off almost immediately. You can see here, the least amount of time in the brake zone is spent on that heavy brake pressure. The longer part of the brake zone spent releasing. And that's where you're going to roll that entry speed in. Eventually, if you get this right, you should naturally start braking deeper. Last thing we work on, though. So hopefully that makes sense. Nelson, do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you're just keeping, think about it as a balance board, right? The weight transfer. You're trying to, yes, you want that weight transfer quickly to transfer the weight onto the front wheels and get the car slowing down. But then you want that to be super, super subtle as you're coming back, so that the grip level remains consistent. You don't want anything too aggressive to switch back, because that's where the car really gets twitchy. So just slowing down that weight transfer back as you're easing out of the brake zone keeps the tires most compliant underneath you, and allows think of the suspension. The suspension is sprung, right? So when we have a spring and it acts really quick, it happens really fast, and that's an abrupt movement. But when we keep it compressed with the brakes and then we slowly let it out, the tire is not changing in grip level very quickly. And that's what removes that twitchiness out of the car.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So let's go here to Joe. There is the rumor that better tires can mask bad habits with the additional grip. Do you think that is true? I have access to the new Michelin scrub tires ran in the current IMSA series, which I think offer more consistency to learn on and coming in at a lower cost versus a brand new 200 treadwear R-Comp tire. Nelson, you're more of the engineering mind than mine. What's your thoughts here?
Well, for starters, if you can have a tire with more grip for less money, and that's
I support that. More grip.
No, it is a rumor. Anytime you say, like they say it about downforce as well. I come from the downforce world, and they say, downforce masks bad habits. And that actually is true, because you can be very, very abrupt true to a point. You can be very abrupt with a really high downforce car, and you can't be that abrupt with, say, a Formula Ford. So, but when you take into account tire, driving to the tire is your job. So it's not masking any bad habits. The car will work better, 100%. A Formula One car works better than a Ford F-150. So yes, it's going to look like you're sliding around more in that pickup truck. But the reality is, I wouldn't say the tire masks bad habits. In actual fact, it teaches you more about how to reach a limit. Because with a lesser set of tires, it's easier to reach that limit. So everybody can reach the limit, and you can slide around, and you'll usually have a little bit more slip angle with a tire that doesn't have as much grip. But it's much harder to reach the limit on a really sticky set of rubber. And learning on that limit, I think, gives you a more finite control and actually teaches you more than teaching you less. How would you feel?
Yeah, I would say if you compare a slick tire to slick tire, more grip doesn't really change anything. If you're, I'm going to make a number up, but 4/10 off of somebody with worse rubber, you're probably going to be 4/10 off of them with better rubber for the most part. Some drivers are a little bit better with lower grip, but if you start to talk about going from a street tire radial tire to a slick tire, I almost say the slick tire does the opposite. It's got the street tire talks to you more, gives you more slip angle before it dumps, where the slick tire just can dump. So a lot of drivers struggle going from the street tire to a racing slick. So I would almost say the racing slick does the opposite, where it unmasks those bad habits and they can bite you more. From a more grippy slick to a less grippy slick, if you can get more grip for less money, I'm 100% behind that.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, exactly. David here. Can you talk about the line through turn 8 at Laguna? I think you mean turn 9. 7, 8, 9's the fast left down the hill. Then you have 10, and then 11's the left-hander. Inside on the entrance left and follow the radius or fight to get to the outside. So if we're talking about turn 9, if you could just send me a message on the chat if you're available. Yeah, okay. So turn 9, I do not want to open up to the right side of the road. It's dirty out there. It gets off camber. The way I treat turn 9 at Laguna is I use all of the road on entry, on the exit out of the corkscrew. I can get it a little bit back to the right. I'm a car width off the inside, but I'm driving that, kind of what we're talking about. I'm going to drive that full throttle as much as I can down the hill. And what I want is when I start my turn in, which is right underneath the bridge, I typically am starting my coast around there. I coast for a long time in turn 9. What I want is enough speed so as I coast, the car just ever so slightly understeers about a car width off that inside line. And then you can see there's not a great visual marker there, but the track the road goes from steep downhill to less steep downhill, which acts like a compression. So as I get to that point and I'm looking through the corner, I'm looking for that apex, I just dab the brake just a tiny bit. I'm not trying to slow down the car. I'm trying to get more weight on the front end to get the car to rotate, to get down to that second apex. And then I'm trying to get to where my front left tire gets up on the apex curve, the blue and white stuff. I don't touch the red hot dog. And I'm trying to only get back to initial throttle as I get to the middle of that apex curve. So keep it to the inside, enough speed. I was almost sort of like a double apex. I don't want to be all the way out to the right. I don't know who teaches that. I see it all the time. It's not good. Let's see here. What are your recommendations for pickup reference point? As a pro driver, using more from visual input or from the seat of the pants feel? Nelson, what do you think?
For me, I think it's quite based on the car that you're driving for sure. But I know in the World Series car and things like that, it's purely visual. You're really, things are happening so fast. You have to be so ahead of the car that your points are very visual based. Now, what you're doing inside of the car is vary from the seat of the pants. But, if you're really focused on what's happening at the seat of the pants and just that's where the majority of your focus is, then you're really going to be too late. Now, when I was in slower cars, it wasn't always that way, but I found at a young age, being visual and being very geographic with my reference points, for me, that was the thing that worked the best. Now, I've had coaches who told me completely different things as I was coming through, it needs to be, you need to be 120 meters ahead, or you need to be 200 meters ahead, or, things like that. But I'm very geographic with my points, and that allows me to maximize everything I'm doing. I'm always looking ahead of the car, but, I'm very specific. We talk a lot about eyes up. I'm very specific about, okay, braking point. Once I'm about to hit that, I'm focused on my apex point. As I start to turn in, I'm now focused on my exit. I know I'm going to hit my apex, so I'm focused on where the car is going to end up next. So I'm very geographic and very visual. But I mean, you're always, your subconscious is always reacting to what the car is doing. There's no doubt about that. And that's what allows you to really scribe those lines, those clean lines out to the exit and things like that. Dion, I'll pass it to you.
I know that we have a really good free article and video on that. I want to say if you go to racers360.com, click on education, we'll have a search bar. I don't remember the title of it. If you try searching vision or you try searching where to look, there's a full in-depth article where we use Sebring, and I kind of break it down exactly what it means to have eyes up. For me, it's kind of, as I'm approaching the brake zone, far ahead, I've identified my brake marker. As I'm starting my initial brake zone, if you're almost still looking at your turning point, it's probably too late. It's almost like you're 2 steps in front of the car, right? So as I'm braking, I've shifted my eyes to the apex, and I'm picking up that turning mark in my peripheral vision. As I'm turning in, I've identified my exit curve, and I'm going to pick up that apex in my peripheral vision. And that's the way I like to think about it, to what eyes up really means.
100%.
Awesome. So let's go here to Spencer. For fast corner, early throttle helps the car feel much more stable. Is this a poor technique for a high-powered rear-wheel drive car? Consider turn 5 at NCM. It's all relative. So I know NCM a little bit less. If I were to use the kink at Road America, turn 12 at Road Atlanta, so those high-commitment corners where there's not really a brake zone, it's more of a lift in or tiny bit of a brake zone, I'm okay with a little bit earlier of a throttle there. It's not a throttle directly after turning point. There's some coast in there. But if you're on throttle 2 car lengths before the apex to settle the rear, I'm mostly okay with that. How about you, Nelson?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like you say, it's all relative. It's not the best practice, but if it's to settle the car and things like that, and you have to elongate your throttle a little bit, then so be it. The penalty is much smaller in a high-speed section where you're rolling in your throttle than it is in a low-speed section where you're not getting to 100% throttle straight away. So it is all relative. I mean, yeah, if it keeps the car more settled and allows you to be consistent through there, then that's something for sure to do. If it's the last point that you need to work on, then for sure it's always more beneficial to be on power at apex and not before. That way you've allowed the car to rotate and do its job the best that it can. But again, it's not as crucial in a high-speed sweeper than it is in a low-speed, be it 90-degree or hairpin or what have you. So, it's not a huge penalty at that part of the track.
Yeah. So we'll go through some of the last. We got about 6 questions left here. This one we've kind of covered a little bit already from Kevin. What's the best way to work on maximizing corner entry speed? Is it getting off the brakes earlier and carrying more speed into the corner until you find the limit? Or is it squeezing the braking zone to be smaller and smaller, struggling between the balance between a slight overslow and a bit too much speed that results in understeer and a missed apex? So Kevin, the way I teach it is the highest risk point is the braking deeper and condensing it. So for me, step 1 is more on that back end of that braking zone. That what we talked about earlier, the first step is, okay, I want to get the throttle here, have that coast, roll in. The second point is going to be working on that brake release, not braking deeper, but getting off of that heavy brake pressure earlier and actually braking for a longer period of time. That is what's going to help your understeer, because now we're going to have a little bit more trail brake. And because we release off the heavy brake pressure earlier, you should be arriving in faster. You should be able to be faster because you've got that front grip that you didn't have before. And then the very last thing that you can work on is braking deeper. That's the way I like to go through things. Let's go to Mark here. When looking at data squiggly lines, can you see and pick out wrong or not so beneficial lines when you don't have video? Absolutely, Mark. You definitely can. Nelson, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was just agreeing with you. I mean, it's very the data makes it stand out quite a lot. So once you know what you're looking for, for sure there's so much to find from data. And as you get closer and closer to the ultimate limit, data becomes more and more important to the point where it's the only thing that matters. So there's always something to find in the data, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sometimes GPS can be slightly off. So I really look relative to one another. And for the most part, you can get a really good feel for lines through data. And you can see, even looking at steering traces, I can quite often tell, oh, this person's understeering massively on exit because of, the early throttle or something like that. And I know that they'll be running wider here. So let's go to Steve. I tend to not use my gearbox enough in my Corvette and leave the car in a higher gear when exiting the corner. Would require a quick downshift and then an upshift at track out. What is a good way to practice that bad habit? Pick a session and just decide that I'll shift way more than I typically would, or pick certain corners to concentrate on?
I'll take this one because I've been working with Steve a bit, and yeah, I mean that's one thing is it's a fundamental, right? So I hate gear shifts. Now I use paddle shifts so I can get away with it. But when I was young, I hated heel and toeing. I hated going through the gearbox and things like that. I wanted to avoid it at all costs. But I just focused a couple practice sessions on, okay, this is the gear I need to be in. So I just look at the track map. Okay, this is a second gear corner. This is a third gear corner. This is a second gear corner. This is a fourth gear corner. And I would just drive around the track as quickly as I could, maybe not necessarily on the pace, ensuring I was in the right gear, ensuring my downshift points were correct. And then eventually you would have your upshift points correct. And just honing myself in and teaching myself. And eventually, the more you spend one session where you downshifted 15 times more than usual, well, guess what? That was 15 times more practice. So it's working that in. And once you realize that when you're in the right gear, the car is a completely different car. So what we've been working on in the videos, like, where the car understeers and oversteers, we can't say what the car is doing until we've done the fundamentals right. Then we can work out what the car is doing. So that's what I would say. Just, not every session has to be quicker than the last session. Sometimes we can be learning about how to be better for the session after this.
Yeah. And for me, it's not a thing of trying to shift way more or picking a corner. It's just being in the right gear in the right corner, right? So that's the fundamental thing. I wouldn't, if you're not wanting to downshift because your heel toe's not strong or something like that, and I used to be a terrible heel toe downshifter, still kind of am. I'm not going to go down. It's not my, it's not my strength. I can do it, no problem. That helps me maybe teach it, but it's definitely not my strength. But that didn't mean I was going to go downshift more to go extra down a gear to practice it. Just meant I just needed to practice it, consistently and think about what I need to do maybe outside of the car. So I wouldn't do anything more than you have to do.
Yeah, sorry, that's exactly what I meant, was just, training ourselves to be in the right gear at the right corner. And then, once you have that habit, then the faster you go, you still know, okay, this is 2 downshifts, boom, boom. And then it goes from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go here to Joseph. Joseph, since I'm an amateur, when driving a turbo vehicle, would you guys pay attention to the boost and try to stay in the boost curve through the apex with like flat foot shifting? Or is this worrying about boost not even a factor, isn't trying to get through the turn and setting up the exit? Speaking on kind of what you just spoke about, but not at a 90-degree hairpin type turn. Most of the time, I think you can spend too much time thinking about the boost. Most of the time, the fundamentals are the fundamentals, and you drive it. And sure, the acceleration may come at a slightly later point, but I get questions a lot like, do I need to have a little bit of left foot brake and then just kind of get the car settled to have my, brake and throttle at the same time? I don't think I've ever done that really in my career. I know that there's some situations, very rarely, but in amateur racing, I would never recommend doing anything like that. And I think most of the time, it just focus on fundamentals is the right thing to do. What do you think, Nelson?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with, boosted turbo cars. I mean, I raced a turbo car before, but it didn't really have any turbo lag per se. So, I went in kind of worried about that, thinking like, oh, I have no experience with this. And after practice 1, I was driving it like a regular car, and
yeah, exactly.
Didn't think about anything else.
I've got a wide range of some historic turbo cars that had some pretty big lag, and old champion Porsche. I drove it the exact same for the most part. Actually, for the Sebring 12, like the Sebring layout, I didn't change a thing. Let's go here. When driving the toe of the boot at Watkins Glen, when should you be back at full throttle? As you straighten the wheel or earlier? Only when you're straightening the wheel. You pretty much, if there's a brake zone like that, I cannot think of a single corner really that's kind of the traditional that I'm on full throttle before I'm starting to unwind the steering wheel. Maybe there's always an exception to the rule, I'm sure. But for me there, again, that's kind of, because they've changed the surface there, it's for me almost like a double apex corner. I'm going to brake super deep as I come up the hill. I don't care too much about getting to the curb initially. I kind of come straight past it, get that car rotated, and then I come back for that second apex. And as I'm unwinding the steering wheel, I'm coming back to that second apex, and I'm starting to attack the throttle. Ditto, turn 7 at Watkins Glen. Tighter line. Sorry, I should say this out loud. Ditto, turn 7 at Watkins Glen. Would you recommend a tighter line for a low horsepower car versus a later turn-in for a higher horsepower car? I actually, to be honest with you, this is embarrassing. I don't know the track. I just know the corner names, corner numbers. What is 7 the boots?
Yeah, well, 1, 2, 3.
Let me just go Google really quick.
7's what I call a carousel, no?
I think that's 6, so I think it's down into it. I've got the track map here.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. I'm just so used to. Oh no, toe of the boot 7. Yeah. So for me, lower horsepower car, I still want to roll in entry speed. So I still treat it as a double apex corner where I'm trying to maximize that entry speed in. I used to keep it tight before they repaved it. Now it's, no matter what I'm driving, it's attack that entry, attack that exit.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So how would you recommend implementing these suggestions wheel to wheel mid corner in race traffic? For me, it's about judgment. So if I'm trying to get a run on somebody, I might brake slightly earlier to let them get a gap so I can roll in that speed, delay my initial throttle, get back to full throttle as early as possible, and get that run out of the corner. So for me, they still apply pretty much the same. Nelson, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in actual fact, it always applies, but I mean, in race traffic or anything, you're really trying to maximize everything possible. So you're trying to maximize your exits and maximize your entries so that you have the most attack and defense available to you. So it 100% applies. Getting better exits is always beneficial.
That's where you really set up the overtake. So we'll go through the last 2 questions here. I'll answer Chris at the end there. Kevin, if I don't have the ability to change spring rates or toe at the track to adjust tire temps, what is more important to target throughout a day at the track? Correct tire pressures or correct tire temps? I'm not an engineer. I would say tire pressures. Nelson, you probably know more than me there. What would you say? Or to kind of together?
It's such a dependent thing. It's a kind of a hard one to answer, but yeah, pressures. I mean, you want to just maximize your contact patch all of the time. You know, you're maximizing the contact patch is key, and if you can't, adjust like cambers and things like that, then, the temperatures are going to be what the temperatures are going to be. And really the tire pressure is what's going to allow you to get the best tire temperature. So, making sure that you're not ballooning the tire and making sure that you're not underinflating the tire is going to actually give you the most even tire temperature across the tire. And this isn't a Pirelli Formula 1 tire. It doesn't need to be within 204 and 206 degrees. It's, the more even the tire temp is, the better. So that all stems from tire pressure, 100%.
So go to Ben's question here. Would you share what you feel are the most important fundamentals? I'll be honest, it's a really tough question, right? Because there's so many fundamentals you're thinking about. For me, it's kind of step 1, basic line choice, opening up the radius, if it's a hairpin, being all the way right, coming in apex and use all the road on exit, kind of line choice. For me, 2 would be really 2 things for step 2. 1, technique of initial brake application, so a good hit of the initial brakes, and applying the throttle in the right spot. I think those are pretty much equally important. And then 3, after that, that's kind of the critical one. The next stage would probably, slowing down your turn-in point and progressing how quickly you turn in to allow the weight transfer of the car to work properly and starting to introduce trail brake. I'd probably say, though, that's for me. I mean, what do you think, Nelson? Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, exactly what this webinar is, I would say. I mean, it's the ensuring that we're allowing the car to work as best as possible, which means we're getting on the power at the right point, not too early, not too late, and line choice, and that's really, those are the fundamentals. And once we have those, the other things come quite easily. Then it's how much track we use and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. To answer Christopher's question on the premium subscription, will premium subscription have content on fundamentals as well? Chris is actually mostly focused on fundamentals. Most of our coaches, when we're talking about what we're looking to improve, I don't think I've done a video here where we're not talking about some type of fundamental change or adaptation. So almost every bit of our content will have a focus on, this is the fundamental flaw, this is why it's wrong, this is how we want to fix it. That's how we coach at Racers 360. So every piece of our content will be aligned with that. And then the last question here from Tom, one that I think both Nelson and I believe in heavily. We see a lot of mistakes around here. And the question is, speaking of downshifting, any comments on downshifting an H-pattern gearbox sequentially, which means 6 to 5, 5 to 4, 4 to 3, or going just straight to the gear, which would mean if you want to go from 6th to 4th, just going out of 6th down to 4th. Big believer, use every gear. So 6th to 5th, 5th to 4th, 4th to 3rd, not going 6th to 3rd. Nelson, you agree?
Yeah, I answered him in the chat because I wasn't sure if we were going to fit his question in. But yeah, I mean, use all the tools that are available. Like I say, if we can slow the car down quicker, tremendous. If I can make the car go from 200 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour in an instant, then tremendous. How do I do that? Using the engine braking with my mechanical braking and just doing the tools, because you never know when it's more than that. When you pop out of 6th and you go to 3rd, you're waiting for that point. So, if somebody goes to attack you, you're not in the right gear. If somebody tries to make a move on you, you're not in the right gear. If something happens in front of you, you're not in the right gear. So always being in the right gear at the right time is I think crucial, but it is quicker as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also more consistent as well. Sorry, I'm just typing as well. So when you go 6th to 5th, 5th to 4th, and if you time the blip of the throttle correctly, which should come as you're going into the next gear, not any earlier than that, you just need 5-10% blip. If you're going from 6th to 3rd, timing that blip, how much blip you need, is a lot more difficult to manage. It becomes a lot easier to lock your rear tires. So as your brain starts to fade, even when you're fresh, it becomes difficult to manage. Kevin, always quicker braking for under 80 meters and going 6th to 5th. Kevin, question on how fast can you get through the gears? Is it always quicker to not skip gears? Once I learned how to heel toe properly, I have never struggled with not being fast enough to go through the gears. So if you've got good technique, there shouldn't really be a situation where you can't get those gear shifts down quick enough in an H-pattern car. If your car was something unique and it was like carbon brakes and H-pattern, maybe that's difficult. But I can't think of a time that I've struggled or not been able to do that. How about you, Nelson?
No, for sure. I mean, I get what Kevin's like. I know back in my shifter kart days, like the braking zones were shorter than my downshift zone, so to speak. And, even in the World Series car, your braking zone's so short that you're really trying to get down to the gears, but it's still, you still have to do the proper steps. Like I say, there's more to it than just maximizing that specific braking zone. You need to be in the gear at all times. And I agree with you. It's very, very difficult to just get that one downshift into 3rd right. And that whole time, you're just kind of in no man's land. You're as you're slowing down, you're now into a super, super low RPM in sixth gear before you downshift to super high RPM in third gear. And if anything happens in that time, like I say, if somebody takes a look or whatever the case may be, you're not in the proper gear. And, and that just makes it very difficult. And then you upset the car quite drastically when you do that downshift. So it's, I strongly believe in, even an 80-meter brake zone, like Kevin had said. I mean, you pop, and it will still be beneficial.
Yeah. And just to answer the last question here, Mark, but isn't the risk of a bad shift if using 3 gear changes instead of 1? It depends how you measure risk. I would say no. Yes, there's more opportunity for entering the wrong gate, but I see much more consistent mistakes on the skipping gears where drivers still end up in the wrong gate, or the blip is wrong and they lock the rear tires and they kind of don't maximize the brake zone. So maybe you could say it's slightly less risk in terms of choosing the wrong gate, but it's not faster, it's less consistent, and I think you will see more mistakes doing it. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. Yes, absolutely. Our premium content will definitely be going over some data analysis stuff. We're going to leave it open to our coaches. So all of our coaches will be creating creating content on whatever they want to do. So maybe Nelson wants to wake up that morning and have a webinar on data or a content piece on data. We'll be covering all different topics. You guys can request things as well, and we'll send that out to our coaches and create things around it. Thank you all for joining us. We really hope that you benefited, learned something new. Hope you'll consider some of our one-on-one coaching online through Racers 360. We know that you'll absolutely love it. Being able to learn personally from Nelson, myself, Mike Skeen, starting at only $99. You just upload your video or data, get back a coaching session within 48 hours or even same-day turnaround time. So thanks again, guys. Look forward to seeing you again. And, best of luck on your on-track journey.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.